changed a month, named the old fifth month after himself. It used to be Quintilius, and he changed it to July after Julius Caesar. And the next emperor, Augustus, names a month after himself, August. And
it's first day of August. First day of August, Mary.
It is.
One more month of summer left here in Northeast Wisconsin. Stand up for the truth. Crash Caudill over here pushing the buttons when I need to. And Mary Danielsen back in the studio live with us today.
Good to be here. I can't believe it's August already. I know all the seasons have the same amount of time, but it doesn't seem that way because it seems to me like time is accelerating somehow. And I've always been really fascinated by the subject of time. I've looked into the biblical concepts of before the foundation of the world, from the foundation of the world, and you got eternity future and other such concepts. And I know as mere mortals, we can barely grasp the idea, but God saw fit to put some fascinating scriptures in front of us so we can at least ponder them. So I highly recommend, if you are fascinated by that as well, that you undertake a study for yourself on what the Bible says about time and eternity. Meanwhile, my scripture passage is Psalm 90, 10-14. Speaking of time, the days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear of you, so is your wrath. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord. How long? And have compassion on your servants. O satisfy us early with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Acknowledge the Lord with me today. Lord, we just thank you and praise you for another day to serve you. Your love is better than life itself. And I pray that you would help us understand more and more the height and the depth and the breadth of that love and how we can be vessels filled to overflowing with your Spirit so that we can represent you correctly to a lost and dying world. Lord, we know how late the hour is. So we lift up our guest, Bill, to you and his ministry, his family, and every need. And we pray you'd give him increasing opportunities for ministry in these times. We thank you ahead of time for all of your provision. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. William Federer is my guest today. He's a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, president of AmeriSearch, Inc., a publishing company dedicated to researching America's heritage. Bill's American Minute radio feature is broadcast daily across America and via the internet. His Faith in History television airs on the TCT network on stations across America and via DirecTV. And you can catch those on AmericanMinute.com. And he has made dozens of radio and television appearances. That's probably a low-ball number there. Speaking engagements, many books, including his first book, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations, and that has sold over 500,000 copies. His works have been quoted by authors, politicians, leaders, journalists, teachers, students, and in court cases. Bill has a remarkable amount of history about America, not just America, in his head and on AmericanMinute.com. It is very impressive. Bill, welcome to Stand Up today.
Mary, my wife had the idea to do a short little 1-minute radio spot. And so I would have one for every day of the year, something that happened on that day. And then I would always try to weave in the role that faith played in it. So I have Battle of the Bulge, but then there'll be Franklin Roosevelt will give an address where he'll talk about, we'll gain the inevitable victory, so help us God, So I'd go through the entire span of history, so Lewis and Clark and Apollo 13 and ancient Assyria and ancient Romans and ancient Israel and World War I, Sergeant Alvin York captures 132 Germans single-handedly and gets the Congressional Gold Medal, and then he starts a Bible school. During the Revolutionary War, you had the Continental Congress declaring days of fasting and prayer, and George Washington ordering his troops to observe the days of fasting and prayer, and then things would happen. Rivers would rise to allow the stop the British from being able to chase the Americans. Fogs would come in, allow Washington soldiers to escape. And so we actually put together a series of books called Miracles in American History. Then so then I'd have people say, well, can you send me the transcript of the radio spot? And I would first mail them out, and then we started emailing them out, and then it turned into an email list. And then since you're not limited to 60 seconds, the email would grow a little bit longer and get into more depth. And then we would have a website, so it's called AmericanMinute.com, and we post them on the website. And there's a little search feature up in the upper left-hand corner where you can type in a word, and it'll pull up all the past American Minutes that have that word in it. So it's the way to reintroduce history. One of the quotes I love is from Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian on John F. Kennedy's staff. And the quote is, "History is to the nation what memory is to the individual." So if you've ever met an individual who has lost their memory, maybe they have Alzheimer's, it's sad. They forgot who they are. They forgot who you are. You can really, if you wanted, you could take anything away from them. Well, we sort of have national Alzheimer's. Here we are, the freest country that planet Earth has ever seen in 6,000 years of recorded history, and we forgot who we are. We forgot how we got here. And we're just sitting there like an Alzheimer patient staring off into space, and they're just taking our freedoms away. And when you tell the history, it's like, okay, here's a big picture. From the beginning of time, the default setting for human government is gang leaders. And when a gang leader gets powerful enough, we call him a king. And it's a hierarchical system. If you're friends with the king, you're more equal. If you're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason. Or you're a slave. And as the centuries go on, these kingdoms get bigger. Because with military advancements, kings can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, you have the Greeks with their bronze weapons, or the Romans with their iron weapons, or the Alexander the Great with the phalanx spears, and the Muslims with the scimitar sword, and the Mongols with the composite bow, where they could shoot 100 yards, but it was only a third as big as an English longbow, so they could shoot it on horseback. And finally, the Chinese invent gunpowder, and the weapon improves, but as that same fallen nature of Cain, Kill, and Abel, and these kingdoms keep getting bigger. And with technological advancements, kings can track more people. The Chinese had a way that they invented of counting with knots and ropes, and then an abacus with rods and beads that you would slide back and forth, and then tokens and dishes, and then markings in the tokens. And then Augustus Caesar wanted to have a worldwide tracking system. It was called the census. If he could have had 5G and satellites and cameras, he would have been tempted to track people that way. And anybody that can do plotting can see that at some time this is going to max out on a global level. And Jesus says wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. And so I tell people history is not prophetic, but it is predictive. And this selfishness of Adam and Eve sinning and Cain killing Abel, it's just magnified through military advancements and technological advancements, and also money, right? So you got these globalists, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and they've got trillions of dollars. And what are they pushing? A globalist World Economic Forum system. And so and it's, you look back in history, if any of these dictators hadn't died, Genghis Khan, I mean, he killed 30 million people from Korea to Hungary. Attila the Hun had an army of 500,000 people wiping out cities of Europe. 6 million died in the Napoleonic Wars. 80 million died in the Communist Party in China. And if any of these dictators hadn't died, any one of them would have been happy to be the Antichrist.
Yeah.
So in that sense, death is a blessing, and the devil has to start from scratch again. But you zoom out and you see, hey, the norm is a gang, and the gang leader is, everybody wants to curry up to his favor. And then you have ancient Israel. So around 1400 BC, they come out of Egypt, and for 400 years, they do not have a king. I mean, here are people that have been slaves for 4 centuries. They can't even read, and suddenly they get downloaded this most unique form of government with no king. And it worked for 400 years. and it was based on every single citizen being taught the law and personally accountable to God to follow the law. So you're about to steal. Nobody's around. You know you can get away with it. And then you think, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police.
Right.
Maximum liberty.
Yeah.
And this system worked for 4 centuries until what? Till the priest stopped teaching the law. You think they did? Yeah, here's Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And then you have a Levite priest with a silver graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. And the tribe of Dan comes along and steals the graven image, and they tell this Levite, come along with us, and you can be a priest to our whole tribe. And you're like, what's this Levite doing with a graven image? Isn't it one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them. And then the terrible story of a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with a woman he's not even married to. He's not following the law. And the poor girl gets raped to death, and by the time you're grossed out, you read this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priest stopped teaching them what was right in the Lord's eyes. And so the self-government system fell apart, and they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, we want to be like the other countries. We want a king. And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells him, they did not reject you. They rejected me. And so anyway, so that's ancient Israel, and it was studied by the founders of colonial New England. And so you had them teaching what? Hebrew at Yale and Harvard.
Wow.
And Yale to this day has Hebrew characters on its coat of arms. And so this idea of kings, so in Europe, the kings look to the Bible for their authority, but they look to the King Saul and on part. The Calvinist Puritans that founded New England looked to the pre-King Saul period of Israel's history, this 400-year period where they have no king, and it worked because every citizen was taught the law and personally accountable to God to follow it. So King Saul, in a sense, is the divider between England and America. And so America's founders look back to ancient Israel as a model of how you can have millions of people and no king. And it works because every citizen is taught the law and personally accountable to God to follow the law. And so I've written several things about how our founders were influenced by ancient Israel. And again, AmericanMinute.com is my website.
Yes, I see this one here. Ancient Israel inspired pilgrims' experiment in self-government. Very, very interesting, very, very detailed. And I'm thinking what you were talking about, collective Alzheimer's. I know Israel had collective Alzheimer's a few times. But also the thing I've noticed in America is when you have that, you have no more have context for anything that's going on. And so you can go back and rewrite and you can revise history because it doesn't really matter what actually happened. And I think, do you think context is the problem here, and that is the end game of just not having a collective memory in this country?
Yeah, there's actually a communist tactic called deconstruction. And it's where you separate a people from their past, get them into a neutral where they don't remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. So it's a drive neutral reverse. So it's a sales technique. If I were a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is I tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently using. You're still brushing with that stuff? Haven't you read it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? Ooh, you're repulsed by it. Now you're in a neutral. You're open-minded. What are all the toothpaste out there? And then I give you my pitch for this brand-new tartar-controlled breath freshener toothpaste. So they go into the classrooms and they tell the children negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians. They sold people into slavery. They were bad. They were chauvinists. And these kids are like, ooh, repulsed by them. Ignoring the fact that the founders, for all their faults, gave you a present, and that present is you get to be in charge of your life, and all of us together are in charge of the country. And we're not ruled by a government mandate that uses fear. It's the people ruling ourselves, bottom up. Forget all that. And so these kids are repulsed by the founders, and now you have the kids into a middle, neutral, open-minded period, and then you give them your pitch for socialism or LGBT trans agenda or Sharia Islam or anything else. And then Europe went through this. So Europe was Catholic and then Protestant, right, with cathedrals and for 1,000 years in Jewish neighborhoods. And then Europe had the French Revolution. and they turned churches into temples of reason, and they didn't want done in the year of the Lord, so they made 1792 the new year one. And they had the French Republic timetables, and they didn't want a 7-day week because it went back to the Bible, so they came up with a 10-day week.
Wow.
A decade week. And then each day had 10 hours. Each hour had 100 minutes. Each minute had 100 seconds. And they used it for about 15 years in France until Napoleon scrapped it. And but they said 10 was the number of man because you counted with 10 fingers. So they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system.
Yeah, that was my next question. Yeah, because Americans aren't interested in the metric system.
But it was this idea in France to de-Christianize itself, and it turned into chopping off the king and queen's head. It doesn't get any better. They chop off the heads of the royalty. It doesn't get better. They chop off the heads of the wealthy. You have money, we don't. You're bad. Then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers. You have food and supplies, we don't. You're bad. Then they chop off the heads of the hoarders. You got extra stuff, we don't have enough. You're bad. Then they chop off the heads of the clergy because they were speaking out against all the head chopping off stuff. And then they chopped off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it. 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France.
Wow.
And so they didn't have God, right? They said there is no God, so who decides what's right and wrong? The group, the collective, the state, the fraternity, the mob. And so that's where socialism came from. So it's the collective.
Wow.
So the motto of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity.
Wow.
Liberty is experienced individually. Fraternity is their word for socialism, the collective. And equality can be understood two ways. In America, it was equal treatment before the law, but in France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternity, the collective, the group, thinks you have too much stuff, it can trample your individual liberty because the benefit of the group outweighs the benefit of the individual. So it tramples your individual liberty, confiscates your stuff, redistributes it, and then kills you. And so the French Revolution is the basis for every socialist revolution since.
Wow.
You kill off the old order, you confiscate all their stuff, and you give it to your supporters.
Yeah. Wow.
But America, we looked back to ancient Israel for the model, and it's you get blessings from God, and you voluntarily share them with your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God.
Right. Wow. This is Stand Up for the Truth. You're listening to Bill Federer today. We're talking about many, many different subjects here. AmericanMinute.com. Bill, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, what a perfect website for homeschoolers. What an incredible resource, because the public school kids, won't be interested in it. But I know that the homeschool kids and Christian families would be. Would you recommend this for kids that are being homeschooled, because it is very, very thorough?
Yeah. I have lots of homeschoolers that use these to supplement and their classes and their curriculum, and I'm even working with Charlie Kirk and Turning Point Academy.
Great.
And they're turning some of my stuff into curriculum as well.
Wow, that's fantastic.
And, getting it into homeschools and Christian schools and so forth.
That's good to hear. We have about 10 minutes in this segment, and I do want to mention the 9th of Av, which was last week. And the Jews have recently ended 3 weeks of mourning with the commemoration, also called Tisha B'Av. It's not really a holiday or feast. It's a Memorial Day that's very unique on the Jewish calendar, and it's a culmination of a season of mourning over the loss of the Jewish temples. But there's way more to it than that, right, Bill? It goes way back to Joshua and Caleb. And can you give us there are quite a few interesting events on the 9th of Av on the Jewish calendar. Could you start us off with Joshua and Caleb?
Right. So the Julius Caesar is the one who switched the Roman Empire from the lunar calendar to the solar calendar, and come up with a 365-day year, and it changed a month, named the old fifth month after himself. It used to be Quintilius, and he changed it to July after Julius Caesar, and the next emperor, Augustus, named a month after himself, August, and Julius Caesar moved the beginning of the year from the spring equinox, which would be like March 22nd, to January 1st, And so when we have the new year starting on January 1st, that goes back to Julius Caesar. And but the Hebrews used a lunar calendar, and they gave the months different names. And so the one was the month of Av, and the 9th day of Av is one that has a history in Israel that is sort of tragic in the sense that the 12 spies went into the promised land for 40 days. They come out, and they said it's great land, and yes, it's everything God promised, right? There's, plenty, and there's honey and cows and milk, but 10 of the spies say there's giants in the land, we're grasshoppers in their sight, there's no way we can conquer it. They spread this fear, and Joshua and Caleb run out there and rip their garments and says, no, the Lord's taken away the enemy's protection. We can conquer this. We can do this. Don't rebel against the Lord. Well, the people, they got into fear. It's one of the first instances of psychological warfare where you defeat an enemy in their mind so they never even make it to the battlefield. And they say, well, let's stone Moses. Let's elect another captain. Let's go back to Egypt and put ourselves back into slavery. And God was so mad at them that he had them wander for 40 years in the wilderness till that whole generation died off, and then he brought them into the promised land. But the day that they rebelled was the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, A-V. And but then they get into the promised land. For 400 years, they don't have a king. And then they get King Saul, who turned into a tyrant and killed most of the priests and tried to kill David. And then King Saul is gone. You have King David. And he collects all the wealth to build the temple, but God tells him because he was a man of war, he's not going to build it. But he collected all the stuff, and he actually designed it. And he left all that to Solomon, and Solomon built it. And so this beautiful temple of Solomon's lasted for hundreds of years. And finally, when Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonians in 587 B.C., the temple was destroyed, and the tribe was carried away into captivity. The tribe of Judah was carried away. And, of course, previously the 10 northern tribes had been carried away to Assyria. But the date that the beautiful Solomon's temple was destroyed was the 9th day of Av in the year 587 B.C. Very tragic day. Well, the Jews returned from Babylon, Cyrus of Persia, and they rebuild a second temple built around 516 B.C., and it was expanded by King Herod in 19 B.C., and that was the one that Jesus and the apostles saw. But then they rejected Jesus, and the Romans had surrounded Jerusalem with Vespasian. And then when the emperor dies, Vespasian leaves his son in charge, and he goes and becomes the emperor. And there's like 2 years where the Jews could have got their defenses up, but instead they start bickering with themselves. 3 different factions. They divide the city of Jerusalem into and they're warring with each other. And it's not until the Romans return and surround the city that they decide to make up with each other. But it's like you just wasted the 2 years. You could have been working on your defenses, but instead you were. And so Titus conquers Jerusalem in 66 A.D., and that's when the temple is destroyed. So Rome's destruction of Jerusalem began in 66 A.D., and then finally Nero committed suicide. The successor was Galba. Then the successor was Othra. The successor was Vitellius. Vespasian was the next emperor. And it was 70 A.D. that the Romans finally broke through the wall. So they had initially began to attack Jerusalem in 66 A.D., but it was in 70 A.D. when they finally break through the walls. And on the 9th of Av, which now that we have a Roman calendar, it would have corresponded to the Roman calendar of September 8th in 70 A.D. but on the Jewish lunar calendar, it was the 9th of Av.
Okay.
That's when the temple was destroyed. Over 1 million Jews were killed in the conquest, and then the ones that were captured were, brought into a Colosseum for sport and killed. And then the Romans decided to hunt down and kill all the remaining descendants of the royal line of David.
That's very interesting to me. That is very interesting to me. So there are no descendants of David alive today, correct?
No.
Okay.
That's that's what these Romans specifically did.
Okay.
They hunted them down, and then you have Trajan, and then Hadrian, and he was around around 135 or so AD, and
yes, and then I noticed
Trajan decided to destroy the Temple Mount, put up a pagan temple to Jupiter. He forbade Jews from coming inside of the city, and he said the problem is their law, so he tries to destroy every copy of the law he can find, and so he makes sure that there's no descendants of David left, and he renames the whole area Palestine. So when you come up with Palestinians, Palestine, where did that name come from? That came from Hadrian. He's the one who decided to try to wipe out the history of Israel.
Well, and Rome experienced a lot of chaos because those 4 emperors, Nero committed suicide, Galba was assassinated, Otho committed suicide, Vitellius was executed, and then the volcanic eruption, and Pompeii was destroyed. Thousands of Romans were buried alive, and then Rome caught fire. There was a plague. God didn't let them get away with any of it.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. It's like they attacked God's people,
right?
And what was the response? Well, it wreaked havoc on Rome. And Emperor Vespasian, who was the first one to attack Jerusalem, he got an illness in 79 AD, and he finally died. And his last words were, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god," because they would deify. You'd have the Roman Senate would make somebody a god. It's like, really?
Yeah,
right. His son Titus becomes the next emperor, and that's when Mount Vesuvius explodes in 79 AD. And I went to Pompeii back in college. I went to school in Europe, and we went through where the poisonous volcanic gases came down and first suffocated them all, and then the ash came down and buried them all. And so you have these mummified bodies in their mouths open and gaping, and in these contorted, but they're preserved because of this ash. And it's like, this is the same Titus that destroyed Jerusalem and set fire and took all those treasures, and this went off. And then after that, the city of Rome caught on fire and burnt down the temple to Jupiter and the Pantheon and Pompeii's theater. Then a plague breaks out.
They can't get a break, can they? We're going to take a break here shortly. Bill, really enjoying your history here. We're talking to Bill Federer, AmericanMinute.com, and we're talking about the 9th of Av, and I want to tease there's a little bit more to that coming up in more modern history. So if you're up early in the morning, Q90FM.com has 2-minute warnings at 5:50 a.m. Central, and you can also catch them on the archives page on demand, 2minutewarnings.org, the number 2minutewarnings.org. We'll be back shortly with more from Bill Federer. Stay with us.
Feedback, questions, and topic suggestions are always appreciated. Email us at comments@standupforthetruth.com.
Welcome back to Stand Up for the Truth. For August 1st, we are speaking with Bill Federer today, and his website, AmericanMinute.com, has so much history. It's just a fantastic education. It'd be great for homeschoolers, or if you just want to understand history a little bit better. Checking out that site, you'll be really glad you did. We've been talking about the 9th of Av, which is a commemoration in Israel that just sometimes it's in July, sometimes it's in August. Again, that's that lunar calendar, that 360-day calendar. But just to summarize here, we've been talking about Israel and some of her history. And then over the following centuries, Israel was invaded or occupied many, many more times. Lincoln wanted to go there. Twain did go there. Absolutely very, very interesting, and it makes 1948 that much more of a miracle. But, Bill, as I was looking through the 9th of Av, over the last couple of years, I've been looking at some of the history of that. And my research says to me that in March of 1492, King Ferdinand of Spain issued the decree that all Jews would have to leave Spain or be killed. The deadline was the 9th of Av, the same day Columbus set sail for America. Also, on the 9th of Av, 1914, World War I began, just a couple days after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. So much 20th century history. But I wanted to camp out a little bit here with Columbus. You had indicated that you had quite a bit of history about him, and I would love to hear what you have to say about that. So if you could fill us in that way.
Sure. Well, Marco Polo went to China in 1271 with his uncle Niccolo Polo and his father Niccolo and his uncle Matteo, and 5,600 miles from Venice, Italy, over to China. And they worked for Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. And this young Marco Polo stayed over there for over a decade, and he learned Chinese. He even became an ambassador for Kublai Khan, who was Mongolian. And even there was a movie with how Marco Polo escorted a woman who was going to be married to somebody, and it was a one of those classic movies that nowadays the movies are all Avengers and Marvel stuff, but a generation or so there would be movies that would have real history in them. And so Marco Polo comes back to Europe, and there is a war between Venice and Genoa. So Italy was not Italy. It was a bunch of city-states, and they always fought. And Machiavelli lived during this time and thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. And so he comes up with the ends justifies the means. But you have these kingdoms fighting, and Marco Polo was captured, and he's made a prisoner in Genoa, Italy. And this is 2 centuries before the invention of the printing press. And so Marco Polo is telling his cellmate about his travels to China and to India. And his cellmate writes them down, and it becomes a bestseller. Of course, every copy is hand-copied, but it's called Il Miliones, which means the million lies, because they thought it was all made up. It was like, Paul Bunyan's Blue Ox up in Minnesota that carved out a valley, and and so he talked about how there were naked holy men in India, and there were fields of blue cloth. Of course, the blue dye, indigo, came from India, and they would dye the cloth and then stretch it out to let it dry. He talked about China inventing gunpowder. He was really fascinated with burning rocks. The Chinese had coal. That the Chinese invented the piñata. They invented paper currency. They invented paper from tree pulp. Wow. They invented a compass, a wheelbarrow. They invented gunpowder. So gunpowder was invented by the Chinese. And so they were technologically superior to Europe. And so his cellmate writes all this down. These books get hand-copied. And where's Columbus born? Well, he's born 2 centuries after Marco Polo in Genoa, Italy, where Marco Polo had been a prisoner. So everybody in Genoa knew of Il Miliones, this book, and this Grand Khan in China on the other side of the world And matter of fact, Kublai Khan had asked Marco Polo to go back to Europe and bring some Christian missionaries. And so Marco Polo gets back, and there's wars, and he couldn't get Christian missionaries. He had 2 friars, Franciscan friars, that were willing to go back with him, but they got scared crossing through an area where the Muslim Turks were conquering, and they turned back. And you thought, gee, how world history would have been different had you had an open door from the Chinese Emperor Kublai Khan to bring Christianity over there. But they missed that door. Anyway, so Columbus grew up hearing about this Grand Khan, hearing about him talking about how he wanted Christian missionaries and how he, had all this wealth and so forth. But the Muslims by the 1400s had conquered Central Asia and cut off the land routes. And so that's when Columbus came up with the idea for a sea route. And he thought the Earth was smaller in diameter than it really is. So you had way back in the the 2nd century BC, there was a Greek guy named Aristophanes, and he pretty fascinating. He had heard that in Aswan, Egypt, the sun cast no shadow down a well at noon on the summer solstice of June 21st. Yet at the exact moment in Alexandria, Egypt, there was a big column that cast a shadow of 7.2 degrees. And 7.2 degrees is 1/50th of a 360-degree circle. And it was known that the distance between Alexandria and Aswan was 500 miles. So all Aristophanes had to do was to multiply 500 miles times 50, and it would equal 25,000 miles.
Wow.
And that's just 99 miles off from the Earth's actual circumference. Wow. So here he is in the, 3rd century or so BC, and he came up with the exact circumference of the Earth.
Wow.
And so everybody knew the Earth was round, but Aristophanes was Greek, and then the Greek area was conquered by the Muslims, and the Arabs had a mile that was a little bit different than the Roman mile. And so the Roman mile was evidently shorter than the Egyptian mile. Arab mile was longer. And anyway, so Columbus said, okay, we know the circumference of the world, but he's using the wrong miles. And so he thinks the Earth is only 19,000, what we would consider 19,000 miles around, rather than the 24,901 miles. So Columbus thought the Earth was smaller, and therefore he thought, well, we can get to China by sailing west. We can meet Kublai Khan. And so he gets to the Caribbean, and he thinks he made it to China. And he is on 4 voyages, but he's walking around Cuba with a letter from the King of Spain to the Grand Khan of China, and he's like, I know he's here somewhere. And he's trying to fit, Japan into Florida. He's trying to fit the Caribbean geography into what little he knows about the Asian geography. And so Columbus takes his 4 voyages. The first voyage, he does find land. He does find people, but he thinks he's in India. And so he names the people he meets Indians. And the name stuck. And so people say, well, why did we call Native Americans Indians? Well, because Columbus thought he was in India. Well, why was Columbus trying to get to India? Well, because the Muslims cut off the land routes to India. And so everybody that hates Columbus needs to turn one chapter back in the history book and see that the very reason he set sail was because of Islamic jihad, of Islamic expansion, conquering Central Asia, cutting off the land routes. And
well, and he said he would have known about like Leif Erikson's voyage, and that was quite a bit before him, correct? And there were other voyages to Newfoundland and places such as that. I mean, it's a wonder we ever got here at all, right? I mean, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so on my American Minute that I deal with Columbus, one of the first stories is the Irish. So Attila the Hun was conquering Europe, and Rome had to pull all of its legions back from the frontiers to protect Rome itself. And so Britain had been a Roman colony for 4 centuries. Julius Caesar was the first one that invaded the British Isles, and up into the 400s, even Constantine was a general stationed in York, England. But and then when the Emperor Diocletian dies, he takes his army and he goes and he becomes the emperor. But so Rome existed in Britain, but when Attila the Hun was conquering, they had to pull their legions back, so it left Britain unprotected. I tell the whole story of St. Patrick, and so that's when St. Patrick is kidnapped by some marauding bands. He's sold as a slave into Ireland. He's there for 6 years, escapes, and then as an adult, he goes back to Ireland as a missionary, and the whole island converts to Christianity. Fascinating story. Wow. And so these Irish would then send missionaries to other places. And the way they would do it is they would go down to the coast and get in a little dinghy boat and raise the sail, and wherever the wind blew them, they figured that was where the Holy Spirit wanted them to be a missionary. Imagine that. And so one of the guys, he raised his sail, and he was blown to the west, and nobody saw him for 7 years. And it was St. Brendan. And he finally comes back, and he describes what sounds like North America. Okay. The coast of Maine with big pine trees and the coast and the no beaches. And so that was 530 A.D. These Irish missionaries write about west of Ireland, there is some land. And then you got around 1000 A.D. is the Viking Leif Erikson, and the Vikings invented boats with low keels so they could go up every river in Europe, and they would kill the men and take the women back with them. But a lot of the women were Christian. And so when the men were off raiding again, the women would have to raise their little Viking kids, and they would raise them to be Christian. And so after a couple generations, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark became Christian. And so these Christian Vikings were called Norsemen or Normans. And so one of these Christian Vikings was Leif Erikson, and he sails in the year 1000 west. And because he's banished, he got on the wrong side of some other king. And so he settles Newfoundland. And it exists there for a couple of centuries until the climate changes and actually gets there was a little ice age. And so for a couple of centuries, the world got colder before it got warmer. But during this time, you have these Vikings talk about this land that's west of Britain and west of Ireland, and Columbus would have known about that. And then you have some of the other, like a Swedish ship in 1362. It sails to Greenland and then possibly sails to America. And there's something called the Kensington Ruin Stone, which is some stone. Some farmer had a tree turn over and the stone was in the roots of the tree, and it was Swedish writing. And they identified it. And, it looks like the same way the Swedes wrote back in 1362. So I think maybe the Swedes had settled something, but the Indians attacked them, and so they didn't follow up. Wow. But then you have 1492 with Columbus, and then an interesting chapter of Chinese. In 1421, there was a Ming emperor named Zhu Di, and Zhu Di had an admiral, Zheng He, and he had treasure fleets that he sent out around the world, and they come back, and they talk about, this is 1421, and they talk about running into land that maybe sounds like the Americas. And so Columbus would have known these different things. And so he knew there was something to the west. He just had the diameter of the earth smaller than it really was. And but he thought he made it to India. But the reason he set sail in the first place was the Turks had conquered the Central Asia and cut off the land routes to India and China.
Very interesting. This is Stand Up for the Truth. We're talking to Bill Federer about history, America, the world. I'm wondering about the British Empire, because my understanding has been over time that the Roman Empire was the largest ever, but now the British Empire, the sun never set, right? It spanned many time zones. The sun never set on the British Empire, and we're still reading in the 20th century about India and Africa. So where does Britannia fit in here? How does that fit in from the Roman Empire to the British Empire?
So you have this study that I've done. I wrote a book called Change to Chains, and I document every single century of recorded human history, what kind of government there is, and all the kings and the kingdoms. So you have Nimrod, Tower of Babel, then Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and then the Assyrians and Babylonians and the Egyptians, and and then you have Cyrus of Persia, and it's conquered by Alexander the Great, and then it's conquered by the Romans. And these kingdoms keep getting bigger because with military advancements, the kings can kill more people.
Right.
And so the Roman Empire was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And then Attila the Hun wipes it out. And then you have Attila's is the biggest empire until he's killed. Then you have a Byzantine Empire. And then you have Islam comes along. And the Byzantine Romans were still using old-fashioned swords. Well, the stirrup for riding horses was a brand new invention, and the Muslims got it first. And so they could be on horseback and conquer. And so they had the biggest empire. And then the Vikings come along. They have the biggest empire because they have these boats with low keels. And the Vikings actually conquered Constantinople. When I went to Constantinople years ago, Istanbul, we went to the Hagia Sophia, this church that was built in 527 AD. It's a massive cavern of a church. And up in the balcony, they got the stone railing on the balcony. And it's got Viking graffiti carved in it. And they have plexiglass over it so that you won't mess it up. But sure enough, there's sort of square type, letters and, who knows what it says. Probably Olaf was here.
Yeah. Right.
And
Sven was here.
But the Vikings conquered that. And then you had Christian Vikings, and they conquered Sicily, and they drove the Muslims out of Italy. And but then you have Genghis Khan in the 1200s. He conquers from Korea to Hungary to Russia. His advantage was stirrup riding horses, but a composite bow. So it's can shoot as far as an English long bow, like a couple hundred yards, but it's a third of the size, so they can use it on horseback. So this Mongolian army with like a 500,000 of them, they'd come around and they could shoot 300 yards away. Their other army couldn't even reach them. And so the Mongols were unstoppable. And then after that, you had the Portuguese sailed around South Africa and made it to India, and then the Spanish. So the Spanish had the world's biggest empire in the 1500s. And then you have King Louis the 14th of France, and he's got the biggest empire. But finally, in the 1800s, Britain has the largest empire that planet Earth had ever seen.
Wow.
They had ships where they had masts, these big long trees that they turned into masts. They got them from Maine. And then they had tar from a tar lake in Trinidad that they could paint the bottoms of the boats with it, and so the barnacles couldn't attach. And so these ships could be really fast, and they conquered the world. And then America decides we want to break away from this globalist one world government king. And so we flip it and make America where the people are the king.
Wow.
But
very, very interesting.
Anyway, AmericanMinute.com is the website where I go through all my history.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and that's absolutely fascinating. The also for me, with the British and the French having an empire of sorts, Austrian-Hungarian alliance, monarchies, old dynasties over in Europe, and then all of a sudden we have World War I. And was that the catalyst that just broke all this apart and how we got into the 20th century here? Because it just seems like all of a sudden things changed with World War I and II. Really the bloodiest century in history is my understanding.
Yeah, you had now the French Revolution had Jacobins, and there was a street named Jacob, and there were these anarchists. They were the Antifa BLM of the day, And their idea was to tear everything down, and out of it will come something wonderful, a new world order. But you first have to tear everything down. They didn't put a lot of thought into what was going to take its place. They just thought that somehow it's going to be better. And what happens is you tear things down, it's chaos, and then out of it rises a dictator, a gang leader. And so their idea is you create crises, or you capitalize on crises, and in the confusion, you consolidate power and set up a structured society that basically is a dictatorship. Well, this French Revolution concept spread in the early 1800s, and Karl Marx and others came up with the idea of having the fomenting crises between the proletariat and the bourgeois, the working class, the business owners, but it's creating crises. And then you have World War I, and because of all the treaties all the countries were in, it was a crisis that started a war that went global, and millions died. And then they redrew all these maps of Europe after World War I. Interesting, they thought that nationalism was the enemy. German nationalists, and so they said, let's redraw the maps of Europe and the Middle East, and let's put competing groups inside of the countries. So there would intentionally be conflict so that you'll never have the country united to have nationalism again.
Oh, that's interesting. I never heard of that.
So in the Middle East, they would put Sunnis and Shiites together into the same country. Well, they hate each other. But they'll be always fighting each other on the inside, and you'll never have a nationalism. They'll put, the Orthodox and the Muslims together. They'll put, all these different groups, and but it was sort of a built-in tension that they had because their enemy was nationalism. But
wow, and there was no Iran or Iraq or modern-day Israel at first, and then Israel comes along, and now they have a common enemy. Now they can say, "Oh, let's just turn our hatred on them." Bill, we only have a couple minutes left, so if we want to just wrap that segment up, that is absolutely fascinating that they had built-in animosity in these groups, and then one wants a caliphate, and you got the Arab Spring and all that sort of thing. That's a very, very interesting insight. But Iran and Iraq, who created Iran and Iraq? Was it the UN?
Yeah, so the World War I, you had Britain, and it was teamed up with Persia or Iran, and Britain didn't have any oil. So in 1908, Britain formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as BP. And so Britain was teamed up with getting oil from Iran, and then the Ottoman Empire teamed up with Germany. And so you had the German-Turkish treaties, Ottoman-German treaties, and they had a Berlin-Baghdad railroad. And so half of World War I took place in the Middle East. So after the war, they redrew the maps of Europe, and they also redrew the maps of the Middle East. And so one of these Arabs in Arabia and in Egypt that helped the British was named Aziz. What was his? Anyway, the name escapes me, but he has two sons, and the British put one of his sons in charge of Syria, and the other son, Abdul, in charge of Jordan. And so Winston Churchill said, I put those people in power. I created those countries. I redrew the maps. I put the people in power. And so then Britain created modern-day Israel with a Balfour Declaration.
Right, yeah.
And but immediately the Arabs didn't like that, and so they said, well, let's give up a little land here, give up a little land there, give up a little land. And so it was this land for peace, but then each time they say, well, if you give up a little land, there'll be peace. They give up land, there's no peace.
Wow.
We'll give up a little more land, and then there'll be peace.
Right,
we'll give up more land, there's no peace. We'll give up a little more land, and then there'll be peace.
And the beat goes on, right, Bill? Thank you so much for joining us. We have to wrap it up. But if you're a history buff, absolutely go to AmericanMinute.com. share that site with people who want to know how to connect some dots. My favorite one is Layman's Prayer Revival, Evangelist D.L. Moody, P.T. Barnum's Greatest Show on Earth, and the Third Great Awakening. That is an American Minute with Bill Federer. So thank you so much, Bill. We really appreciate you. Visit standupforthetruth.com and sign up for our weekly podcast digest. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Thanks for joining us.